Hello, friends. Tonight, we are joined by celebrated author and Sherlockian scholar, Leslie Klinger. Les is not only responsible for the new annotated Sherlock Holmes and the 10-volume Sherlock Holmes reference library, but he has also been called the world's first consulting Sherlockian for his behind-the-scenes work on a myriad of film and television projects, including the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes films, Netflix's Enola Holmes, the CBS series Elementary, and more. His other works include the new annotated Dracula, the new annotated H.P. Lovecraft, the annotated Watchmen, the annotated Sandman, and many more. His latest book, the new annotated Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, just hit bookstores and is available now at Amazon, poisonedpen.com, and the author's website, lesliesklinger.com. As with all of Les's volumes, the new Jekyll and Hyde is a beautiful, exhaustively researched work of art and scholarship, and I highly recommend picking one up. And so, without further ado, we give you Leslie Klinger. Les, it's so good of you to join us today.
Thank you.
Well, firstly, congrats on the new book, the new annotated Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, available now at fine bookstores everywhere. I was lucky enough to pick up my copy in your presence at the Poison Pen bookstore in Scottsdale, where you were also kind enough to inscribe it and date it. And you informed me that because you were signing it prior to the official release date, that makes an autographed copy even more sought after by collectors. Is this true? I'm oblivious to these things.
I think it is true.
Okay.
I don't think that, in my case, it probably makes it worth $1 more than the price it was anyway. But if you're a book collector and you look at signed copies, pre-pub date copies are important, often because the pub dates are a little bit obscure when you're talking about 19th century books and the like. So
yeah, good to know. I just wasn't sure if you were pulling my leg, but it sounds like that's actually a real thing.
When you sell it on eBay, Gus, you'll get an extra buck for it. Absolutely.
Fantastic. I'll look forward to that day. Well, before we dive into Jekyll and Hyde a bit, obviously, we're huge fans of your work on Sherlock Holmes. And I realize it's been about, 18 years since you released the 3-volume set?
Well, yeah, it's hard for me to believe that, but that's true. And so my adventure with annotating Sherlock Holmes really started much earlier than that. It started in the mid-90s when I had decided that I had enough spare time, the kids were old enough, that I could start to write articles about Sherlock Holmes. And so I started to write for the Baker Street Journal, the Sherlock Holmes Journal, some of the what we call Science Society publications. These are amateur academic type journals that study Sherlock Holmes. So I had written 3 or 4 articles, and I had always had this dream that someday maybe I would update the Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes, which was published in 1968. Mm-hmm. And of course, for an entire generation or more, was the standard work on Sherlock Holmes. I used to give it to friends as bar mitzvah gifts because it was $35 for this huge box set. It was great. Mm-hmm. But in the mid-90s, I decided, you know what? I don't really need to keep waiting till I retire. I'm going to start doing this. And I did a couple of stories, and I sent them off to some friends, various Sherlockian friends, and said, what do you think? And one of them came back and said quite properly, well, this is terrible because you can't just reprint Baring Gould's footnotes and sort of make them longer and then add some of your own. You have to get permission to do that. Oh, yeah, that's true. So I took that very much to heart. But in any event, it did spark the interest of Steve Doyle and Mark Gagan, who were the 2 guys behind Gassagine Books, mm-hmm. Now known as Wessex Press.
Yeah.
And they said to me, this is good. Are you willing to do this sort of 1 volume at a time? We decided the adventures would be the first. And I said, sure. So we knocked out the adventures, and that became eventually the first volume of what was known as the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library. Right. So somebody described my writing style in that. They said law review. Now, that wasn't a compliment. That They were talking about the fact that if you look at some of those pages, you'll see one line of text and the rest of the page is a footnote. But so I did those for about 4 years. I just in order. I did the adventures, then the memoirs, then we did Study in Scarlet, and so on. And then in 2002, out of the blue, I got a call from the senior editor at W.W. Norton who said, we're going to be reprinting the Baring Gould edition, and we want to redo it, and we hear you should be the guy who edits it. And I said, me? I'm a lawyer in Los Angeles. I'm not a writer. No, we hear you're already doing this, which was, of course, true. So my initial thought was, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. They're just going to take my reference library books and put hardcovers on them, and I'm going to get a lot of money, and great. No, they decided, first of all, they wanted pictures, lots and lots and lots of pictures. And second, they wanted me to rewrite every single footnote because they didn't want the sort of law review style. They wanted a more conversational tone. They wanted a different focus. They wanted it to focus more on historical and social context rather than Sherlockian theories. And less quotations from third-party critics and more of my own stuff. So anyway, you're right. I started doing it and finished the first 2 volumes in 2004, and then the 3rd volume in 2005. And there they are. And it's hard to believe that that's now 18 years ago, but you're right.
Well, so my big question about that then is, do we need to rush out and obtain the copies of the reference library because they're out of print now, correct? Is it significantly different?
No, I think they are still, Wessex, they go out of print every once in a while. They'll run out of print in 1 volume and then they'll reprint it. They are different. First of all, as I said, there's much more third-party material in the reference library. If you don't have a library like mine, which has virtually everything ever written about Sherlock Holmes, you're going to want to read the original source material, which I quoted some length in those books. So they're different.
Okay.
I'd say, as any good marketer should, you need both.
Right. The main reason I ask is because I was looking at the apocrypha volume, and that one seems to be out of print because the prices that it's fetching on the internet are pretty high.
Well, I don't know why it's out of print. I mean, it should be, they can print out 100 copies without a material cost.
Yeah, maybe they will.
And that one is not quite unique because there's been a couple other writers who collected the apocrypha, but I'm the only one who annotated the apocrypha. And they're really interesting.
Yeah.
The apocrypha, by the way, I mean, we should explain for those who don't understand, is a biblical term, of course, just like the canon is a biblical term. So the apocrypha are the stories that Conan Doyle wrote, but they're not really part of the, quote, canon. They're not part of the 60 official Sherlock Holmes stories. 2 of them are stories that are about an investigator who seems to be a lot like Sherlock Holmes, but isn't named. Some of them are stories that Conan Doyle actually wrote, or somebody wrote some parodies of Sherlock Holmes. There's a play in there that was never produced called Angels of Darkness. There's an outline of a short story and some other interesting materials. So it's just more, for those of us who always want more.
Right. Well, just to jump around a little bit here, I mean, as you know, our focus here stems from our love of Jeremy Brett's portrayal of the great detective. Yes. And kind of from there, we weave in and out of the scholarship on the subject. But what were your thoughts on Jeremy Brett's portrayal when you first saw it? I mean,
mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, just mind-blowing. It's in a way, and I don't think I've ever said this before, I very much remember seeing Star Wars, the first Star Wars. And when the curtain went back and the lights went down and that ship comes straight out of the screen at you, it was like, oh my God, they got it right.
Yeah.
And it was the same reaction seeing Brett doing A Scandal in Bohemia, the first one that he did. And of course, Gail Honeycutt, who could not fall in love with Gail Honeycutt, but oh my God, they got it right. That was my reaction. And despite all the competition and my fondness for Robert Downey and for many of the other portrayals, Brett is still the high water mark, I think, mainly in terms of sort of catching the true spirit of the stories. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you've talked about this many times. Of all of the portrayals, they are the truest in terms of adherence to the original texts.
Yeah.
And that was very much, Brett's doing. I mean, he encouraged that. Michael Cox wanted to do that. So as an admirer of the original stuff, I really appreciated that.
And obviously it changed a bit as time went on. Jeremy's health suffered,
Yes.
and there were changes of the guard all around. But did you stick with the show over the years? Did your feelings change on it as time went by?
No,
or?
I think I saw every single episode and enjoyed them. And interesting to compare my reaction, which we'll get to about Sherlock. But no, I mean, there were liberties taken in later seasons, obviously, for various reasons.
Yeah.
But certainly overall, the production values were incredible. The verisimilitude was excellent. So, it still stands as my favorite.
Yeah.
There are things to admire in lots of other adaptations, but that was the best.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're here. Well, coming back to the reference library for a moment, you actually got a blurb from Michael Cox, who called it a publishing triumph. Did you know Michael Cox?
No, but he had appeared. So Doyle and Gagan have also done a series of programs they call From Gillette to Brett.
Right.
And he came as a guest speaker one year to that kind of a film festival. I did get to meet Ted Hardwick. Ted was there as a guest on one year. And I actually met Brett and Hardwick in London. I saw The Secret of Sherlock Holmes, the strange play that they did.
Yeah.
And went backstage afterwards and my daughter got her T-shirt signed by Jeremy Brett and all that. So she was very excited, and so was I.
That's great.
I mean, it was a 30-second conversation. So,
but do you remember what he said in those 30 seconds?
No, I have no recollection other than "nice to meet you" or something. So
right. But Edward Hardwick was at the Gillette to Brett?
Yes, and I did get to chat with him, and just a wonderful man, very warm, and I'm old enough to remember his father, and been a big fan of his father. So,
yeah.
But I always thought I did prefer him to David Burke, the original Watson, if you will.
Scandalous.
Well, but then we get into the topic of Watson generally. I mean, so much as I like Ted Hardwick, he was too old for the part. So was Brett, but okay, put that aside.
Right.
I have said repeatedly that Jude Law is the best Watson I ever saw. So, fine actor, and just really, that's the real Dr. Watson, this sort of young, energetic doctor. My favorite scene in the Downey films is the scene where they're riding in a carriage and Holmes looks at him and says, "Watson, you have the grand gift of silence." A wonderful line right out of the canon. And Watson punches him in the nose. It just was, it was the part that Doyle left out, but he certainly had in his head.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful.
Do you get nervous every time there's a new Sherlock coming out, knowing that everybody you know is going to go, "What did you think?"
Yeah, a little bit. It's a challenge, and I try not to be, as I've said many times, and I said to you privately, there are many rooms in our father's house, so any Sherlock Holmes is a good Sherlock Holmes, in my view, if it's done with affection.
Yeah.
If it's done if it's done in a sort of mean spirit, and I even like the Peter Cook Dudley Moore version. I don't think that was really mean spirited. I think that's the way they felt about Holmes. They undoubtedly read the Holmes stories when they were schoolboys and had this sort of British humor attitude about it. But there have been some bad ones. I mean, Sherlock Holmes versus Dinosaurs, or whatever the name of that one is, isn't a great film by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
I must say, I have never seen Holmes and Watson, the Will Ferrell version.
Neither have I.
I draw the line there. I've heard too much about it to make me interested in seeing it. But, Sherlock Holmes' smarter brother, hey, count me in.
It's all right. Yeah.
I did actually interface with Moffat and Gatiss on the Sherlock series. And they actually, PBS reached out to me to do what I called tweet notes as that series was airing, sort of live on-air footnotes.
Interesting. Is there a record of that? Can we go find that and check that out?
I don't know. It may be. I don't know. Does Twitter get preserved forever?
I don't know.
But they're out there. While the shows were airing, I did cheat, They gave me the episodes ahead of time so I could watch them first. And then I didn't prepare, but I at least knew what was coming.
Right.
So then while it was sort of on the air, I had a stack of books around and I would tweet things like, oh, this is a scene from that story. And this is, a reference to this and so on. So I typically did, 50 or 60 tweets per episode.
Wow.
It was a lot of fun.
We'll have to get some of our web friends on that and see if we can unearth
They
that.
should be out there, but it's the kind of thing that you're going to have to just scroll for now years of tweets, but they should be there.
I'm not one of these people that posts, dailies. So maybe I've tweeted 1,000 times in my life.
Yeah.
So it isn't going to take that much scrolling to do it. When you do it, though, do send it to me. I've never collected them.
Well, coming back to the books for a moment, when it comes to the annotated sources, there's so much data out there in so many sources. Was there any particular example of a scoop or a piece of new scholarship that you put in the new annotated Sherlock that you're particularly proud of?
Yes. Well, I set out to not make a mark. I mean, that wasn't my aim. I wanted to pull together the 30 years of scholarship that came after Baring Gould's edition. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've done with every book I've annotated. I mean, I've tried. One of my criticisms of my friend S.T. Joshi's annotated Lovecraft is that the only source he ever notes is his own.
Right.
And I wanted to include the wide universe of scholarship in my footnotes. But there were certainly points that either A, I could cite my own article on a subject. Yes, that's one of the privileges of being the editor. And in a few cases, I did sort of on the fly have to come up with new thoughts about it. I hadn't written an article about it. Nobody else had talked about something. And so, sure, one of my favorites that I think I actually turned into a short article later was about the story, The Stockbroker's Clerk, in which we have Watson leaping on the poor dead Arthur Pinner and giving him artificial respiration. And I said to myself, wait a minute, this is 1890. What's that? What was it at the time? And so I wrote a whole note about the history of artificial respiration that nobody had ever sort of talked about before.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. It's not eureka discoveries, although there are sometimes those. It's more like, gee, this is really much more interesting than it might appear on the surface, and nobody's talked about this before.
Well, and there's another aspect to the annotated books, Baring Gould in particular, but I wanted to ask you from your point of view, and that is the game. And, Sherlockian scholarship is unique because it does have this game tangent to it.
Not so unique, but semi-unique.
True enough. You're right. But obviously Baring Gould didn't shy away from kind of including a bit of that information in his annotations.
Oh, a great deal of it.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, probably 25% of his annotations are on the subject of chronology.
Right.
So by chronology, we mean, and this is something that's sort of outside the universe of adaptations, what we mean is figuring out the dates on which the events in the story took place. Yeah, I had to say that carefully to sort of parse it out. But chronology is in itself a very complicated game, if you will. And there are at this point maybe as many as 30 competing chronologies. I mean, different views of how to do that. There's 60 pieces to the puzzle. And it's not easy to fit them together in a way that's coherent.
Yeah.
So Baring Gould spent a good deal of time on that in his footnotes because it was one of his hobbies. And a lot of those key off of the weather. I made a decision that was simply less interesting to me and downplayed that considerably. I threw away most of his chronological footnotes and simply noted at the end of the story the dates that he and other scholars had assigned to the story. Yeah. But the most important aspect, I think, of playing the game is what I'll call the reconciliation process. If this is true, then why does the story say this? Mm-hmm. The most obvious one is Watson's wound. Why is it in his shoulder in some stories and in his leg in other stories? And there are, as you know, a multiplicity of theories. My favorites being my friend Laurie King's theory about the Jezzail bullet and how the bullets were manufactured literally out of garbage by the Afghan tribesmen scrap metal, and et cetera. And it's clear to her that the bullet split on the point of just almost on impact and actually did wound Watson in two different places. Yeah. Very logical.
Well, if you say 25% of Baring Gould is game related, what percentage of your books would you say?
Oh, at least that much.
Yeah,
at least that much. Because I went to some lengths to discuss the theories, the alternate theories that are out there. So I generally divide the notes into three big categories. Category number one is just plain and simple glossary. We don't speak Victorian English, so what the heck does this word mean? Mm-hmm. Number two category would be what I call social and historical context. Who are these people that are talking about? Who is Gladstone and Disraeli, and who was Queen Victoria and who was in her court, and so on. And the same with places. What is this place? What does it look like when you have a switchboard in Victorian England for telephones, et cetera? All those kinds of, as I say, sort of historical context. Yeah. And then the third big category is the theories, is the game playing of, well, who was this really? Where was this really? When was this really? And how do we reconcile that Holmes did this when the right thing to have done would have been that? So, yeah, there's a good deal of that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I did the same in my annotated Dracula. Mm-hmm. And not everybody liked it. They didn't. There weren't enough Draculians who sort of got the tongue in one's cheek.
Yeah. Well, and that's just it. I think that's the way to look at it. I mean, I can't remember if it was your book now or a different one, but I remember one note specifically in one of the annotated books that made it very clear that since we never see the Rewcastle boy after the dog has been killed, that he must have been a werewolf.
I may have referenced it, but it wasn't my theory. No, okay. It definitely wasn't my theory. And, when you take these things seriously, you find all the interesting byways. You were asking about sort of eureka discoveries. My biggest eureka was actually in Dracula. So this is really obscure because it is in the manuscript of Dracula, not the published text. Mm. So in the manuscript, there's a reference. If you remember Dracula, if you've read Dracula, mm-hmm. Dracula, when he comes to England, his ship lands in Whitby, and the ship is wrecked on the shore, and a giant black dog leaps off the ship and runs off through the town. Now, we, being smart, quickly understand that that's Dracula having shapeshifted into the form of a giant wolf type. And there's a newspaper account of the dog having torn the throat out of another dog in the town. And they find some murder victim there, some victim. And in the newspaper account, and again, I say this wasn't in the published version. It was in the manuscript and it was cut out. Mm-hmm. It refers to the police are examining the eyeballs of the dog in order to identify the killer. Mm. And I said, WTF? What is that? Well, it turns out that there was a Victorian pseudoscience called optography.
Right.
That some doctor, I've forgotten his name, had the idea that the retina acted like a pinhole camera and recorded images, and that the dying image, the last thing you saw, would have been recorded on the retina. Jules Verne wrote an entire mystery novel based on that.
Yeah.
And the doctor killed a whole lot of rabbits trying to prove his theory. He never could, and the science was ultimately disproved. But I thought, wow, that is so cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. Yeah. Well, I'd like to jump around a little because you've dipped your toe in so many iterations of Sherlockiana. One of the hats that you have been known to wear is that of a consultant on film and television projects. You've consulted on everything from the Robert Downey Jr. films to Enola Holmes and Elementary. How does that work when they retain you to consult? I mean, tell us a little bit about that process for you.
So the first thing you have to develop if you're going to be as my friend Lindsay Fay coined, the world's first consulting Sherlockian, which I love the phrase. It's just, you have to develop a thick skin because you have to live with what's going to happen. And what's going to happen is you're going to read the script and you're going to say, well, that's wrong. that you've gotten that totally backwards. That's wrong. And they're going to say to you, thanks very much. We're going to do it anyway. Artistic, creative license. Thanks. As long as the thanks is accompanied by a check, it's better.
Yeah.
It's really funny. There's a story. I don't know if you are a Kim Newman fan.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Kim, a wonderful writer who has written a series of stories about the Diogenes Club as well. And in one of the stories, his character, whose name is, I think, Charles Beauregard, I've forgotten, Charles, who works for the Diogenes Club. The Diogenes Club is headed by Mycroft Holmes. It's really MI5 or something like that. It's sort of a secret agency in England. So in any event, he's called upon to consult on the John Barrymore silent Sherlock Holmes film. And there is a scene where he goes to the set where they're shooting the picture, and on the outside of the building they're using, it says 221B. And he says to the producers, that's wrong. You can't do that. The real address was 221. B would have been the apartment number, and it wouldn't be on the outside of the building. And they said to him, thanks very much, but everybody knows it's 221B. We're going to do that anyway. Yeah. And I said to Kim, who's a friend, footnote, Kim was introduced to me when I was in England promoting Dracula as, by the way, you're going to be interviewed by the BBC's vampire expert. Who knew the BBC had a vampire expert? But so I said to Kim, did you make that up? He said, yeah, it just seemed like something that would have happened. I said, it did happen on the Downey film with me.
Wow.
So life imitates art, imitates life, or something.
Amazing. Well, as you've mentioned, your background is actually in practicing law. So I'm just kind of curious, what's the current time split for you between lawyering and writing?
Full-time lawyering and writing fits into the crevices around it.
That's
so,
great.
One of the things you learn as a lawyer is to juggle projects. I'm not a litigator. I do tax, estate planning, business work. And so on any given day, I may work on 10 or 20 different clients and their matters, and sort of juggling all these balls. And so I learned early on that writing was just one more larger ball to juggle. And I just work it in and around the schedule. If the books were bestsellers, I could afford to retire. But as it is, I require lawyering to support this addiction.
Well, and of course, because of the lawyering aspect, we have to at least touch briefly, I think, on the Free Sherlock movement because, well, I guess a little bit of backstory for our listeners who might not know, and you can correct me if any of this is inaccurate, but back in 2013, you filed a copyright lawsuit against the Conan Doyle estate.
Yes.
In what would become known as the Free Sherlock movement. But this was actually kind of your pushback against the Conan Doyle estate, essentially constantly, basically legally bullying everyone who tried to write pastiches.
Yes.
Even when they were just using public domain stories. So
exactly. So what happened was, Laurie King and I created a series of anthologies that were new stories inspired by the Sherlock Holmes characters by a variety of writers, some great writers. And the first volume came out from Random House, and apparently the Conan Doyle estate the Conan Doyle Estate Limited is a company owned by the remaining collateral descendants. These are his grandniece and grandnephew, I think, of Conan Doyle, who owned at that time the copyrights in the US to the 10 stories that were under copyright. 50 stories were free of copyright.
Yeah.
And by the way, 50 stories were free of copyright everywhere else in the world as well, as were the 10 stories that were in copyright in the US. They contacted Random House and they said, oh, gee, you need a license from us to use the character of Sherlock Holmes. Random House said, it costs us more than they're asking to even talk to our lawyers. We're just going to pay. We didn't have any control over that. That happened. We then did a second volume with a different publisher, a smaller press, and a similar threatening letter from the Conan Doyle estate. And the publisher said, what do I do? I can't afford to print a bunch of books and then just sit around with them while they block the sales on Amazon, et cetera, which is what they threatened to do. Mm-hmm. They basically said, we're going to go to Amazon and tell them not to sell your books. So Laurie and I blithely without a deep thought, said, well, we'll sue them. We'll get this cleared right up. So we engaged a lawyer. We designed the case to be as streamlined as possible. We filed in the Northern District of Illinois, which is where the estate had an office. And we asked the court for what's called declaratory relief. That is, we asked the court to rule that they were wrong, that we had the right to use the characters without their permission. The estate defaulted, didn't even bother to answer. Court granted a judgment. We then filed a motion. I think we filed a motion we asked the court to write a full opinion so that there was a reasoned basis. And at that point, the estate showed up and said, can we speak on the issue? And they did. The court gave them permission to do that, and they lost. The district court ruled in our favor. The estate immediately appealed to the Seventh Circuit, where we were fortunate to get as the lead jurist, Richard Posner, who is an eminent judge, been on the bench for many, many years, and fancies himself to be the world's greatest expert on copyright. And he wrote a scathing opinion in which he called the Conan Doyle Estate Limited extortionists. He said Klinger is doing a public service here, serving as a private attorney general, stopping you guys from blackmailing people into paying your license fees.
Wow.
What could it possibly mean that 50 stories are no longer protected from copyright if they can't use the character elements that appear in those stories? So not only did the court rule in our favor and rake the estate over the coals, they also awarded fees to us.
Wow.
The Conan Doyle Estate Limited, seeing their lemon about to be squeezed totally dry, immediately appealed to the Supreme Court. The court refused to hear the case, and so it was over.
Yeah.
I'm honored that it's now being taught in law school as a case in the casebook, that as long as you don't use character elements that appear exclusively in the copyrighted material, you can use the rest. So today, there are still 2 stories remaining in copyright in the US. Those 2 will be free of copyright, by the way, come January 1st. And so nothing will remain in copyright. But we were able at that point, certainly, to use the names of Holmes and Watson, Mrs. Hudson, the deerstalker, the magnifying glass, the bloodhound, all of those things that appeared in public domain stories freely. Now, the estate didn't give up quietly. They continued to go after other creators. They went after the makers of Mr. Holmes.
Right.
That was Miramax.
Yeah.
Claiming that the idea that Holmes retired was somehow protected. They went after the Enola Holmes people for the first film, claiming that the idea that Sherlock Holmes could be a nice person occasionally was copyrighted because it only happened in the later stories, they said. This was, of course, total nonsense.
Yeah.
They applied for a trademark, and we opposed the application for a trademark, and the Conan Doyle estate withdrew the application the minute we filed an opposition. Our argument was quite simple. If you can't copyright it, you can't trademark it. So there is a trademark for the Conan Doyle Estate Limited, that they have the whole little seal and all that they stamp on things that are authorized by the Conan Doyle Estate Limited.
Yeah.
But we're at the point now where essentially you are free to use the Sherlock Holmes material without copyright restrictions.
That's wonderful. Yeah. It seems like probably after January 1st, the only thing they're going to have going for them is that seal, if you want an official stamp.
That's right.
Yeah.
It turned out Lori and I were foolish in thinking how little the case would cost. But we were very fortunate to end up with, between the court orders making the estate pay for most of it and donations from various other interested parties, we ended up being out of pocket only a smallish amount. My wife still doesn't know all the details of how much we were exposed to at one point, but it just, even that kind of a stream. This is a case that never had a trial.
Right.
There wasn't a single witness, and yet it still cost probably $100,000 in legal fees. So,
No, well, you did a great service. Thank you so much.
because they just made me angry.
Yeah.
It just made me angry. And it's terrible because as a lawyer, I'm always telling my clients, don't ever think about bringing a lawsuit on principle.
Right.
You can't bring cases on principle. You can't afford to in our justice system.
I was actually just recently having a very similar conversation to this about a different topic, and the person was referencing what he called the big stick principle, which is if they can take you to court and squeeze out all your money, then you'll lose anyway, regardless of the argument.
Absolutely, and that's what they were doing. They basically they were practical enough. The Conan Doyle Estate Limited, to charge relatively modest fees. So I don't really know all the details. My guess is, for example, that on the Downey films, they charged like $100,000 fee for the license. Well, on $100 million production budget, that's just not material. You don't get the lawyers involved, you just pay.
Right.
So they were getting a lot of money that way. And for creators who were doing their own little self-published books, they might charge $100 or $500 or something like that.
Yeah.
So people tended to say, yes, I'll just pay. Now, Sherlock Holmes is not the only character in this situation, of course. Hercule Poirot, there are public domain stories and copyrighted stories. Tarzan, there are public domain stories and copyrighted stories. Zorro is in that camp, and there are others, that John Carter of Mars, etc.
Yeah.
So the law is not going to go away. I love that Posner said, so when they make Star Wars 14 and they reference Luke Skywalker, don't come around here telling me that gives copyright protection to the character of Luke Skywalker,
Right. And speaking of the Doyle estate, I noticed in the liner notes to your annotated editions, there's a special thanks to Dame Jean Conan Doyle for allowing you to use the casebook stories back then. Did you actually get to spend time with Dame Jean?
No, absolutely not. I had to negotiate that with the agent for the estate.
Okay.
At the time, it was really an interesting situation. We were licensing this in 2002. The Bono Act had just extended the length of copyright, but it had not been tested in court yet. So it seemed likely that the estate was going to have a license, but not clear. I had to negotiate with the estate about the casebook. It had been all over the internet already. I mean, anybody who wanted to could download a copy of the casebook.
Sure.
But the estate was adamant that they wanted a hefty license fee. I didn't really have a choice. I offered them a royalty, and I'm now eternally grateful that they turned it down. They demanded a significant flat fee instead, and they made a huge mistake economically, it turns out. I mean, the book has done much better than I anticipated, but it was a very bitter negotiation and a lot of hostility on both sides, unfortunately. But and a contrasting story, by the way, is the Lovecraft estate. He did not renew the copyrights. It's unclear that Weird Tales ever filed for copyrights when they appeared there, and so on. There is a company called Lovecraft Holdings that claims to own the rights because he left whatever he had to his aunt, who then transferred them to this company. So in dealing with the company, we said to them, look, we'd like to license the rights, but our condition is that we'll be happy to pay you for the rights if you can show us chain of title, prove to us that you have the copyrights. And they said, how about instead you just give us 4 copies of the book? And we said, that's great. Let's make a deal. So
that's great.
Nice.
Well, I want to jump now over to your latest work, the new annotated strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What was Stevenson's original impetus or, inspiration to write Jekyll and Hyde?
Well, I think there were a lot of things going on in his head. I mean, part of it is simply that he was disappointed, I guess is a mild word, about the hypocrisy of what he saw as the society around him and his own hypocrisy. He was pressed by his family to become an architect. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to be an artist, but he was living the life of a respectable professional class for a while in England until he finally chucked it and moved to Tahiti. But so hypocrisy was a theme that very much interested him, as did the whole idea of the double life. He was fascinated by a man named William Brodie, also known as Deacon Brodie, who had by day been a very respectable member of the church and by night led a gang of thieves. He was so interested in him, he wrote a stage play about Deacon Brodie with William Henley. And he'd written a couple other stories about this idea of double identities. And so had others. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe had written about it. There were beginning to be some psychological studies of multiple personalities, split personalities. But Stevenson saw this as a very fundamental human issue. He called it that old war of the members, talking about, that as humans, we have to reconcile the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other, or however you want to think of it, sort of our good impulses and our more bestial or evil impulses. Mm-hmm. So he conceived of this story about a man who makes bad choices about how to do that and fails to do that reconciliation, that harmonization. We don't really know from Stevenson's story where Jekyll went bad when he was younger. I mean, he did some bad things, but it's not clear what they were.
Yeah.
At least not in the published version, what they were. Were they sexual? Were they homosexual escapades? Who knows? But he's clearly still trying to repent for it. And he has this wrong-headed notion that if he can separate out the evil part, he can be a better person. He can be just the good part, instead of understanding that what he needed to do was to integrate it.
Right.
So, the inspiration was, I think, in like great artists, it was a combination of sort of personal issues and a desire to tackle this larger theme. Now, the momentary impulse appears to have been a dream. He had a dream in which he saw one of the critical scenes in the book, what he called the window scene, where Jekyll is hanging out of the window talking to the detective, Gabriel Utterson, and then sort of yanked back all of a sudden. And we learn later he's yanked back by Hyde sort of taking over. Mm-hmm. But he saw that scene in a dream, and it clicked, and he, in a fever, wrote this manuscript. He wrote it in like 3 days, and then it was burned.
Yeah.
I say it was because there are conflicting claims over who burned it,
right,
and whether it really was burned, but it seems plausible that it was burned. It was probably burned, I think, by his wife Florence, because she didn't like the sexual elements of the story. I think the first draft was probably too explicit for her, and she wanted it to be more allegorical. But in any event, he rewrote it from scratch, and in 6 weeks total, finished the book, and it came out to great success.
Yeah.
One of the things that interested me, by the way, was to try and look at the changes that it went through as he went through that process. So I did a lot of textual comparison of the original manuscript, the printer's galleys, and the final published version.
Yeah, and all those are included in the book, which is amazing.
Yes. And by the way, I mean, that's something that I've done to the extent I can. I've done it a good deal with Sherlock Holmes as well.
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes, there are only 37 manuscripts that are out there for the 60 stories. And I've seen certainly most of them. I've seen maybe 20 of them. Some of them at libraries, some of them have been published, but it's fascinating to see that. And Doyle is one of those really annoying writers who either just got, as they said in the movie Amadeus, dictation from God,
right,
or was just such a brilliant writer that he made very few corrections. What's tantalizing is the thought that maybe there were earlier versions that nobody has ever seen,
right,
that he just copied over for the versions that we now think of as the manuscripts.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, you mentioned in the past that Stevenson actually pronounced the doctor's name as Jekyll.
Yes, and it was actually a family that he knew. It was a Scottish family. Gertrude Jekyll was a very well-known landscape designer / gardener, and her younger brother was a good friend of Stevenson's. So he borrowed the family name, and they pronounced it Jekyll.
Yeah.
So, but of course, nobody else since
Right.
Stevenson has.
I was curious, has it been mispronounced always? I mean, since its
I think
publication?
so.
Did he ever push back against that? Did he ever publish anything saying you're saying it wrong?
He was interviewed and said that he pronounced it Jekyll.
Yeah, okay.
There's an old newspaper interview with him in which he said that. So
Yeah, I mean, I know of at least one film, I think it was one of the Hammer films actually, where they say his name correctly. And it's almost disorienting because you're so used to it the other way. I
Right.
can't remember which movie it is now. But speaking of that, though, for us film fanatics, there is a robust appendix in this volume which exhaustively lists all of the film and television adaptations that have ever been done of this story. And it's frankly, I mean, it's kind of amazing to see Hollywood's obsession with this material. I mean, I think the first
Yes.
one was a silent film back in 1908. I mean, it goes back that far. It's amazing.
yes, there's an early. I mean, Stan Laurel appeared in
Yeah.
in an early version, and not with Hardy. I mean, it's not that kind of comedy,
Right.
but it's. And by the way, I think that one it was Dr. Seakill
Hmm.
something. So they did know the right pronunciation,
Attempted
since
it.
otherwise Seakill doesn't rhyme with Jekyll.
Right.
Hyde and Seakill.
Yeah. One of my favorite entries in that table is for the 1972 film entitled The Adult Version of Jekyll and Hyde, because your description is a waste of time with virtually no connection to the book.
Yes, well, and then there's films like Jekyll and Hyde Together Again.
Right,
and
comedy.
There's some wonderful comic versions. There's a Tom and Jerry one. There's a Daffy Duck one. And by the way, YouTube is a tremendous resource for this. If you haven't seen, I think 3 of the silents are on YouTube, including the magnificent John Barrymore 1920 silent version.
Yeah.
And readily available are the Spencer Tracy and Frederick March versions, which are terrific.
Yeah. Well, and another great thing about this volume are the color images. I mean, there's so much incredible artwork in there, from old movie posters to newspaper clippings. There's even a color
And
scan.
illustrated editions.
That's what I was going to say.
Illustrated
Yeah,
editions.
there's even a color scan of the title page of the original first edition booklet.
Yes.
Is that hard? I mean, when it comes to publishers going full color on a book like this, is that a challenge?
Yes, it's expensive.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
So the publisher was very nervous. I mean, this is unfortunately, even though it's a third of the size of my sort of usual book, it's $40 retail.
Yeah.
And that's because of the color.
Yeah, it feels like it's worth it for that.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful book. They really did a number on it, and I'm very proud of it. But if you really want to appreciate the illustrations, get the ebook version, because you can blow them up, and they're very high quality. They're very high resolution scans.
Oh, very nice.
So they really blow up well. Yeah, I did movie stills, comic book covers, lobby cards, posters, and a lot of sort of contemporary images. Plus, as I was saying, there are, I think, at least 5 different illustrated editions of Jekyll and Hyde that I reproduced illustrations from.
Right.
And in some cases, it's really interesting to see side by side different artists' take on the identical scene.
Yeah.
No, it's a thing to behold. It's amazing. Well, Les, thank you for taking the time with us today, and very best wishes with Jekyll and Hyde and all of your future endeavors.
My pleasure. This has been great. It's been kind of wide ranging, but that's fun. We didn't mention it all. For those who like comics, my annotated Sandman or annotated Watchmen,
Yeah.
which were also tremendous fun. One of the things that I would just say about those, and because it sort of ties into some of the things we talked about, and that is textual analysis and all that. One of the great treats in my career has been working with Neil Gaiman and Dave Gibbons to talk to the, quote, authors of this material. Usually when I do Jekyll and Hyde or Sherlock Holmes, I don't get to talk to Conan Doyle or Stevenson about sort of why did you do that? In those cases, especially in the case of Annotated American Gods, which I did with Neil Gaiman, we had extended, hours and hours of conversation about my notes and what I had missed, what I had misunderstood, what I should supplement, and so on. And that is such a treat to do.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back on, Les, because there's so much more. I mean, we could talk for an hour about Lovecraft. We could talk for 3 hours about Lovecraft. But I just want to say, just so you know, our podcast has been going for a few years now. And even though we haven't spoken much before this, your books are the ones we constantly refer to. And so it feels like you're always with us on the show. And now you actually have been.
Oh, well, thank you. I had that same nice compliment from the people behind Elementary, and I love that show. And they said, "Yep, your books are sitting here in the writers' room." And they would every once in a while they would email me something that they couldn't figure out from the books. So it's a treat to do that. Happy to do this again sometime.
Okay, we'll reconnect soon.
Great to be with you guys.
Take care.
See you later.
All right, take care.